Israel has given civilians still trapped inside Gaza City a 4-hour window to leave. Many escaping the city said they passed tanks on the way out, ready to storm the area. Israel says its forces have surrounded the city, which is home to a third of the enclave's 2.3 million people. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has also said the country would consider little pauses to allow aid or hostages to exit. Since violence erupted a month ago, Hamas fighters killed 1,400 people in Israel and took more than 240 hostages. Israel has bombarded Gaza from the air, imposed a siege, and launched a ground assault, stirring global alarm at humanitarian conditions in the enclave. The health ministry in the Hamas-controlled area says at least 10,000 Palestinians have been killed, including 4,104 children.
I am compelled to respond to the statements that were made by honourable members and to say that it is vital that we reflect accurate history and do not distort the reality of the experience of the people of Palestine, not just for one day or 1 week or 1 month, but for decades. And we need to be honest about that. It is most distressing when members of parliament ignore facts. This cannot be something that we tolerate. It is also untrue that South Africa has not criticized Hamas for its breach of international human rights law. It has. The President stated very clearly, in concert with the Secretary General of the United Nations, that the killing of civilians and taking of hostages is a violation of international human rights law. So we must be accurate in all our contributions.
The fact that you are with Russia, the fact that you are with Hamas, the fact that you are with Iran, you went there. Today they've reacted by saying the AGUA process, they will have to take a course of corrective action in Congress. That's the reality. You say it's okay. You say it's okay. Now, Honourable Minister, unfortunately, I don't have the time to discuss all these things with you. I've got 4 minutes. But let me conclude. I have reason to believe that you've got good contacts with Hamas and you've got good contacts with Iran. Oh, yes, you do. Now, let me tell you,
members,
the conflict can
allow the
stop.
Speaker to conclude.
The conflict can stop today. Today. 3 conditions, 3 of them. The missiles fired from Gaza must stop. The missiles must stop. Secondly, all hostages must be released immediately. Thirdly, the perpetrators of these atrocities by Hamas must be punished. I hope the Minister listened. I hope you will convey this. I'm telling you, there are 3. You don't listen to me. You don't listen to me. You don't have to listen to me. The ANC is on the wrong side of history, and that's why you will be rejected.
Thank you very much, Honourable Dr. Melda.
Goodbye to the ANC.
We're here to stand with Palestine. We're here to take sides in favor of the oppressed, condemn Israel and declare that it is a murderous apartheid regime engaged in systematic extermination of Palestinians. It is not a single event. They are engaged in a system permanently subjecting Palestinians to racial humiliation. We do this because we understand that our freedom here was attained through massive international solidarity by peoples of the world, 90% of which had never set foot here. It is in this context that we are responding to the suffering of a people who live thousands of kilometers from South Africa. We know that we're international citizens. As we stand here, Israel has massacred over 10,000 Palestinians in Gaza under their military assault, killing children, bombing churches, hospitals, schools.
The ACDP asserts that South Africa has a moral obligation to support a negotiated solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to distance itself from a radicalized position on Israel, a position which undermines any hope of a negotiated process and a peaceful outcome. The ACDP believes that the recalling of South Africa's diplomats in Israel will not serve any benefit to the Palestinian people. It simply removes South Africa's ability and authority to play a mediated role in any future peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians.
And that was the parliamentary debate there in the National Assembly on the ongoing war in the Middle East. And let's stay with this particular issue and speak to a visiting professor at the University of Pretoria, Garth le Pere, who says South Africa must break off diplomatic relations with Israel. Prof, let me thank you so much for your time this evening. Let's start first with your reaction to the recall of our diplomats for consultations, as Cabinet has announced yesterday.
I think, this is really a first step to registering South Africa's disquiet with the situation. It is long overdue, really, because South Africa recalled its ambassador, Cesar Ngombani, in 2018 as a prelude, to the cabinet making an unequivocal decision to break off diplomatic relations with Israel. However, South Africa has maintained those relations in the hope that, it plays some kind of mediating role in the conflict, mindful of our own historical experience. But I think it's come to this inescapable conclusion now that the conflict has now reached a cul-de-sac. And the minister in the presidency has also expressed a very strong opinion about the Israeli ambassador in South Africa, Elliot Belotsakovsky, and his remarks as being untenable. And he will be called in for a démarche, I think, which is really to register the government's displeasure about his comment. I hope, in terms of the article I wrote in the Sunday Times, this is a prelude to doing what Bolivia did and having the courage of our convictions and breaking off relations with Israel until there is some level of, some level of decency and normalcy on the side of the Israeli government, recognize the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. And this is a historical conflict, as we know. It dates back centuries. And we can date it, back to the Yishuv, the establishment of the Jewish community in Palestine, the different evolutions, the lineages of Zionist ideology that gives Israel, the sort of ideological legitimacy to do what it's doing today in a sort of zero-sum struggle where Palestinians now find themselves in this dehumanized and very tragic situation. And not to say that I hold any brief for Hamas, but I think that, Israel was looking for some kind of an outlet, as it were, to really, push Gaza into the end game, which is what we see now, the total destruction de facto, of the Gaza Strip, and the tragic human consequences that go with it.
So hopefully we re-establish with Garth le Pere, but for now, let's ask what the mechanics are of a recall, and we get another view on this development by international relations with Dr Kingsley Makhubela, who is the former ambassador to Portugal and former High Commissioner to Kenya, who joins us now. Dr Makhubela is also the director of RiskRecon, which is an advisory service. Dr Makhubela, good evening to you and welcome. This move that's now been made to recall these diplomats for consultation, how serious a signal is this?
Well, Iman, what a pleasure to join. I haven't spoken to you for years now. I really don't understand, and I don't think it's the right move to entirely remove your diplomats during the time when they are more required actually to follow events on the ground and be able to advise government about possible action or possible intervention that may be required from the South African government side. And at this hour of need, we're not going to have any diplomat on the ground, because what it means essentially is that we have a temporary closure of the embassy. Because we recalled the ambassador in 2018, Cesar Ngombani, he has never been replaced since then. So I don't know who's going to advise the government in terms of really understanding the dynamics on the ground and so on.
So the minister, and this is Naledi Pandor, who you heard a short time ago speaking and addressing the National Assembly about the Israel-Gaza war, or the Israel-Hamas war, saying earlier that the recall was normal practice, but this is key, that they will give a full briefing and then they would make this decision on whether a continued relationship is actually able to be sustained. Do you see it as making that ultimate move in severing the tie, or is this still leaving the door open?
You know, I listened to the minister attentively, and my fear was that I hope she's not going to announce to Parliament that we are severing our ties as a country with Israel, because I think that would be a bad move. Remember, diplomacy, it's a strategic tool that South Africa should use to advance the interests of the country. And diplomacy, it's a continuous process. We can't, when the going is tough, we then withdraw the ambassador. It won't serve any purpose. It won't advance the interests of the Palestinian. I think the interests of the Palestinian will be more advanced by South Africa, that is quite savvy in terms of understanding the dynamics on the ground, speaking to everyone across the board. You know, I like what the minister said a few weeks ago when she spoke to Hamas representative. And I think this is the right thing to do, to speak to everyone involved in the conflict. But to shut down diplomacy at this stage with Israel, I think we're losing a strategic tool that we should have used to really advance the cause of the Palestinians.
Dr. Makhubela, is it unusual to recall all diplomatic staff as we're doing now?
Well, it's unprecedented, Imani. Usually, countries will recall the ambassador and really kind of downgrade the level of representation in the country. But we've done that some time ago. And I've seen the statement, it says all diplomats. But what worries me with the statement that was issued by the cabinet yesterday, Imani, is the fact that the cabinet is pushing the buck back to the bureaucrats at DECO to say they must look for an appropriate sanction for the Israeli ambassador within the diplomatic. No. Didn't they really debate this thing in cabinet that DECO advised to say, given this behavior of this ambassador, this is the possible action? Cabinet is delegating to DECO, and DECO should have made recommendation to cabinet, and the cabinet makes a decision. And that's why you're seeing paralysis of government to act. To me, as an outsider, Iman, it tells me that there was no agreement, no unanimous agreement within the cabinet. That's why they're pushing this into the bureaucrats.
So, I mean, talking about that proposed démarche, which is to really express your concern and disquiet over an action, you know, that a diplomat of that caliber has made in the country, that's what seems to be afoot. And we saw it happen with Ambassador Brigati over the whole Lady R situation. It doesn't mean, or at least to the public, it doesn't mean as if it's the end of the relationship, but it is saying, and I think just to quote the minister, there seems to be the strange practice among some ambassadors in South Africa that they can just say what they like. I don't know if it's because we're an African country and they disrespect us, but it's something that we should not tolerate. Is this not an appropriate route to go, to register that you are a guest in someone's country and you should behave accordingly?
No, it's that I agree entirely. If an ambassador misbehaves, you have to conduct a démarche and really dress down. The démarche is actually meant to dress down the ambassador behind closed doors. And that's what should happen. That's what happens in this diplomatic circle. But, you know, Imani, what is worrying has been the language that comes from the Israeli representatives across the board. I mean, a few weeks ago, I listened to the Israeli ambassador at the UN, literally insulting the Secretary General of the UN and telling the Secretary General actually that he should resign. And this was followed by Eli Cohen, the foreign minister of Israel, really attacking the United Nations Security Council Institute and the Secretary General in particular. So what we are seeing happening here, it's what I think instructions have been given by Tel Aviv how to behave to people who are considered to be hostile to the Israelis. That's why you've seen this kind of a behavior. But I don't think we should fall for this trap. We should use our diplomatic statecraft to advance the interests of the Republic. The interest of the Republic is much bigger than that. We really have people who will be in distress in that part of the world, and who's going to give them consular services?
Right.
We're going to have to understand, to speak to the Palestinian on the ground. We're going to deny ourselves of that opportunity because we opted to move out at a time when we need to reinforce our presence there.
Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, given, as you say, it's better to be in than out, it's better to be in the room, have that platform, maintain the relationship so those channels of communication are there. Given the polarity of views on this, the view of the Israeli government on the stance that South Africa has taken, how does South Africa repair, if indeed it wants to, these relationships and reinstitute diplomatic ties to the point where there is South African diplomatic representation in Israel and vice versa?
I remember, Imani, when South Africa recalls its diplomats in Tel Aviv, we'd have to inform the foreign ministry that we are recalling all our diplomats for consultation. When South Africa sends them back, must do the same, right to the Israelis that we intend to send them back on such a day. And you can't send them back before the Israelis give concurrence to that. The Israelis, they are likely, and I'm sure they are likely to ignore any communication in terms of sending diplomats back until it's conducive for them. And they would use that as a weapon against us. Meanwhile, their representative here, we are unlikely to request the ambassador be recalled. But remember, there's a standing resolution of the ANC that we must sever diplomatic relations with Israel. I don't know if the ANC is intending to do this because we are now approaching the general election next year. But I think I would never advise government to do that. I have a totally different view to how we should use our diplomacy to really advance our interests. Remember the definition of diplomacy that I like, very simple. It says it's continuous negotiation. It's harmless, it's innocuous, and that's a definition that was coined by Cardinal Richelieu many years ago. If diplomacy is a continuous negotiations, why do we move away from the table to continue to negotiate and advance the interests of the country?
Thank you so much, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, for those insights. And Dr. Makhubela,
thank you, Imani.
You're welcome, is also the director of RiskRecon.
All right, let's go back now to our guest, Professor Garth le Pere, in fact, who is joining us, who is a visiting professor at the University of Pretoria. Prof, thank you so much for reconnecting again. We just heard from our previous speaker, who's a former ambassador, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, who says that, and I quote, "We should not sever all ties with Israel. Diplomacy is a continuous process." And earlier you were telling us that South Africa needs to sever all ties. And he says that why get off the table when you should stay at the table and negotiate?
Dr. Makhubela resorts to, diplomatic technicalities and niceties. In diplomacy, there is a normative imperative where relations have to be conducted, where there is some kind of moral compass in the relationship, where there must be mutual benefit between the two sides, This is an essential historical underpinning of diplomacy where, one side has to respect rights of the other side and vice versa. In other words, there has to be some kind of mutual recognition of interests. In my view, the mutual recognition of interests between Israel and South Africa have irrevocably broken down. Let us recall, in 1995, President Mandela bent over backwards to develop a platform of rapprochement with Israel, to the point where South Africa crafted a binational commission with Israel. That was, an offer, a recognition, an acknowledgement of South Africa's bona fides towards Israel in the context of this conflict. Relations have deteriorated since then, and South Africa has maintained diplomatic relations with Israel until recalling Ambassador in 2018. I think we have reached a point where you cross the frontier of what is morally correct. There is now an ethical imperative for South Africa to nail its colors to the mast, regardless of the diplomatic niceties and the technicalities that, Dr. Makhubela mentioned.
Yeah. And
I see no value, frankly, in having a dialogue with Israel, which is now, And the facts are incontrovertible. There is no scope for the Oslo Accords of 1993 to pave the way for a two-state solution. That is dead.
So, Prof.
It's dead and buried. And what Israel wants to do in Gaza, I think now is, abundantly clear. And that is to reshape the context, reshape the architecture of politics in Gaza and the West Bank to the point where we have a situation that is reminiscent, of Thucydides in his Peloponnesian War, where the powerful get what they must and the weak suffer what they will. We are reaching that, and I think it's really important. If Bolivia can do this, a small country in South America, take off relations with Israel as a moral imperative, so should we. Send this kind of message that we can't be party to maintaining diplomatic relations with a country that is really conducting a genocidal war against a people that have legitimate rights.
And Prof.
And as I said in my article, there's no space for territorial compromise because the absolutism of Israeli, the Israeli approach and the Zionist underpinnings of its ideology, essentially do not recognize, the nationalist yearnings of the Palestinians towards statehood.
And Prof, I just wanted
we now have reached an impasse.
Yeah.
Where, it's almost what Gramsci wrote in his prison notebook. The old is dying, the new can't be born, and in the interregnum we deal with morbid symptoms. These morbid symptoms will be reproduced until who knows when.
Prof, I'm not sure if you're able to hear us.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you. Pardon me. I'm not sure if you're able to hear me. I was trying to come in there, but pardon me for coming in there. But we're hearing tonight, 1 month into this particular war, that a 4-hour window has been given to civilians who are still trapped inside Gaza City. And today, of course, marking a month since this particular conflict began. You've been on the ground. You've watched the situation unfold before, as this is a historical conflict. I wonder, what does this 4-hour window then mean, practically speaking, on the ground, as you've seen this devastation before?
Well, it's a temporary pause, as I understand it, which will allow humanitarian aid to pass through the Rafah Gate, which connects the Gaza Strip with the Sinai under the control of Egypt, until Israel decides otherwise. So it's not a ceasefire. It's a temporary pause to allow humanitarian aid, which is, essential foods, medicine, fuel, and so on, to get through. That does not really, relieve the situation on the ground, because, you can imagine total anxiety, fear, and desperation of the people that have to, live under this constant, aerial bombardment. Not knowing where it's coming from. It seems very arbitrary to me, because the logic of the Israeli bombardment is essentially to go up putative Hamas targets, mindful from the Israeli perspective that Hamas uses civilian infrastructure, to hide weaponry, to hide the soldiers, etc., etc. It seems to me, the end game is essentially, to flatten Gaza to the point where Israel is satisfied that Hamas no longer exists. And that is a non-starter. That just defies essential logic.
All right, Prof, thank you.
Because Hamas was elected democratically in 2006. The stereotypes might label it as a terrorist organization. But on the record, they have done much to improve the welfare of the citizens of Gaza in a way the Israeli blockade has really undermined.
All right,
so,
Prof.
We have the standoff, and I think that the pressures have to come from the United States in the first instance, for total ceasefire, and for some, voices of reason to prevail, where you can have some sort of
All right, Prof, your line is letting us down there, but thank you so much. We did get a sense of what you were saying there. That was visiting professor at the University of Pretoria, Garth le Pere.